In this video we're going to talk about snapshots 3 and 4 of our RSS Reader application. If you've been following up to this point, you'll note that we have already created the UI for our RSS Reader application. We've also talked about how to display the various dialogues to add and edit a channel and add and edit a folder for our application, but we really haven't written any true functionality. We haven't grabbed data from the database, and we have not grabbed data from the internet and put it into the database in the first place. So that's one of the things that we wanted to do, in this third snapshot, was to actually go to the internet and grab data down. So I double-clicked on the RSS button, and I started to work, and I'm going to close some of these windows so we can look at the actual code here. And I encourage you to take a look at the snapshot 3 code that is available for download, so that you can kind of parse through it and look and see if you understand all these things. But this is very similar to what we did in lesson number 10 when we were looking at XML files, working with them, opening them up, and it's just a little bit different. Instead of grabbing it from a file on the hard drive, we need to grab it from the internet. So why did I choose to do this before I chose to work on the database? Well, that's a good question. There's really no one great place to start in developing an application. Usually what I do is I try to tackle the functionality first that's the most complex. And in my mind, this was one of the biggest unknowns. Would I be able to go to the internet and grab information off and parse through it? So I wanted to tackle it first, because if I save this to the very end of the project, then I might get some surprises that might alter the way that I think about it, and it could create quite a mess. Because of my experience level, I know that I'm able to save things into a database and grab them out. So I'm not too worried about that. But this step was a little bit more iffy because I'd have to put a little bit more thought into it. So I wanted to make sure that this worked first. That's why we're kind of moving this to fairly early in the development process. And you can see at this point I have simply coded this all behind a refresh RSS toolstrip button click event. What I'll probably do in the next iteration is separate this code out and put it into its own class so that it can be used across multiple projects in the future, so that I can kind of pull out some of the business logic, this functionality, and not put everything behind the buttons in my form. I just don't feel right about that. It makes the code so bloated and so much to look at here in this one file that it's sometimes difficult to manage and work with. And then that separation allows me, as I alluded to just a moment ago, to use it across multiple projects. Now in this snapshot, one of the things I didn't do very well that I probably need to come back and do is add quite a bit of comments so that I can refresh my memory as to what I was doing here, because this is a fairly lengthy passage of code, and it might not be obvious to me later on, or to those who might help me work on it in the future, what I was trying to accomplish. So this is one of those instances where do as I say, not as I do, because I probably should have added a little bit more code here. And that's part of the process, coming back and thinking about what you could have done better. Okay, so let's go through this line by line. Beginning in line number 76, you can see that I've defined a variable called RSS URL. And what I wanted to do in this first pass was just hard code a known RSS feed so that I could prove to myself that a proof of concept that I could grab down data and that I could parse through it. So I've just hard coded in this particular case just to make this work. Next, in lines 78 and 79, what I wanted to do was grab the actual data from the URL. So we're going to go out on the web to that URL, and we're going to use the system.net namespace in order to create a new web request, and this object simply encapsulates all the information needed in order to request information from a web resource, in this case our XML file, our RSS XML. And then I wanted to create an my response object, which basically will capture the data that's pulled back from the web request. So you can see that I'm setting my web response equal to my request, which was defined in line 78, get response. So basically we're just going to say, give me this data from msdn.microsoft.com/rssxml, and when I get it, I'm going to save it in a request object. Now that request object is going to give me data back in a very unformatted sort of way. And if you recall from our discussion in Lesson 10 about streams, and we just talked about this at a very high level, but think of it as a straw sucking information out of a cup. We don't really know how it tastes or what it looks like at this point, to extend the analogy. It's just stuff that's coming through a straw in a very serialized format. So that's what we're doing in line 81, where we're grabbing this RSS stream. But in line 83, we want to take that stream and we want to convert it into an XML document. So we create an RSS doc, and then in line 84, we load that RSS stream into our document. Okay. Now, just take note, if you review Lesson 10, where we were looking at retrieving data from the file system and compare it to what we're doing right here, it's very similar. The only difference is how we're grabbing data from a database, or I'm sorry, from a text file, essentially, versus grabbing it from online. But the same steps are involved. Taking a stream, converting that stream into XML, and loading that XML into a format that we can work with in XML document object by using the load method of that XML document, passing in the stream. Okay? So now what we want to do is, in line 86, use an XPath query to just grab down all the individual items from the channel. So according to the specification, we know that there should be an RSS parent node. Under the RSS node, there should be a channel node, and underneath the channel node, there should be a series of items. So we want to collect all the individual items and put them into an XML node list. Then what we'll do is iterate through that node list and grab off the individual items for each node. So we should expect to see a title, a description, and a link for each of the items that are pulled off from our RSS feed. So in line 88 through 90, I'm going to create some temporary little storage containers that will allow me to save off that data, title, link, and description. So I already have a collection of RSS items called RSS items, as you can see here in line 94. And in line 92, I want to create a temporary storage tank for a specific item that we're currently working with. So we're going to loop through each item. Each time we loop in this for each statement, we're going to pull the next item from the list into this current RSS item object. And then we're going to go through the process of pulling off the title, the link, and the description, as you can see in lines 97 through approximately 123. And it's the same process for each one. First of all, we want to make sure that when we're selecting a single node from each RSS item, that it actually contains something. So we're going to do a little check. If it's not nothing, then we're going to use the inner text property of our single node and grab that off into a little variable called title in this case. And we'll do the same thing for link, the same process, and the same thing for description as well. We're going to expand this example to check and make sure that the data isn't too large for our database and that it doesn't contain characters that our database might choke on. So this is just really our first pass through it. Now I've written some to-dos here as well, stubbed out some additional functionality that I know I'll need eventually, but for right now I just want to make mental note of what I'll need to do to fully implement this function. Right now I'll be impressed if I can just go out to the internet, grab data down, and then display them in a message box. So that's what I want to do at this point. So let's save any changes that I may have accidentally made, and then we're going to run our application. So at this point we want to just cross our fingers and run the application and see how well this works. We're going to click our Refresh RSS button. It's going out to the internet, and notice now that we get a message box and it pulls back some of the data. We have our title, we have our link, and then we also have the description. You can see that they're not really well delimited, but we grab that data. Now it's just going to continue to loop through each of the items that are pulled down from the RSS feed and display them in message boxes. And this will continue on and on for each individual item. Now ideally what we'll want to do is take this data and store it in a database. So that's really our next step after this. So let's just go here and stop the execution of our application so we can get out gracefully. And I think that pretty much does it for explaining how this one little method works. That's all we did within an hour to an hour and a half period of time. And we're going to continue on now to the fourth snapshot. In snapshot 4, I had a small change of heart. I was planning on building the database. However, after thinking about it for a few moments, I decided to insert another step in the process, and that is to extract out the code that I wrote in the previous snapshot that's behind this button click event, this refresh RSS tool strip button click that we just did in the previous snapshot, and place that code into a new class and a new method to support that class. And the reason I did this was really twofold. First of all, it's typically a best practice to take any of your business rules and place them, abstract them out into their own class. Now, what is a business rule? Well, sometimes you might think of business rules as like the rules of business. You know, this is how our business does business versus how your business does business. But in fact, I mean, it's a very generic term that's used to describe any functionality that's non-visual. You know, in this particular case, the functionality that goes out to the internet and grabs down an RSS feed and parses it out, should that really be in our UI code, in our main form.vb code? Well, probably not. It probably deserves to have its own class, and so it can be managed a little bit more succinctly. So our main form.vb only has code in it that concerns itself with displaying information to a user, and the code that we place into this new class RSS Manager is only code that deals with grabbing down RSS and parsing through it. And so, you know, that at least helps us find, for example, where problems might be. We can look in one spot as opposed to multiple spots throughout our application. Kind of some of the concepts we talked about in lesson number 6. And then the other benefit we get is that of reusability. So, for example, if I wanted to use this method that I created, and let's open up RSS Manager here, this refresh RSS method that we created in the previous snapshot, then all we need to do is just share this particular class, our RSS Manager class, amongst different applications, and we get to reuse that functionality. So it's really a cohesive unit of work that's all stored within one file, this RSS Manager.vb file. So we've modified our functionality here by putting it within the context of a method. So you can see here I have public shared sub refresh RSS. Passing in an RSS URL will then pretty much perform all the functionality that we had before. Now we're going to need to modify this over time because there's some additional functionality we need to add in here that we haven't gotten to yet. But this is really the first step. We just wanted to kind of take it out and put it into its own class. So I've got some cleanup work. For example, I notice now that I've spelled refresh incorrectly, and I'm also going to need to figure out a better way of returning values back. Right now we're just displaying everything in a message box, but do I want to have this particular class know everything about storing the values in a database? Well, that would make it very specific to this particular application. So I may want to rethink that. We'll probably do that in the next snapshot or two. But at this point, it can be called from our main form.vb. So here again, I'm still using that hard-coded URL to grab data from that RSS XML feed from msdn@microsoft.com, and we're just calling our refresh RSS, passing in our RSS URL. And so let's just make sure that this still works correctly, and we're just going to click our button here. And after a moment or two, we get a little pop-up box, so we know that our code still works. Great. And that's another little best practice. You want to make small improvements to your code and then test frequently. If you make too many changes or add too much code without testing, then it's more difficult to determine exactly where you made mistakes. You'll have to go through more and more code. Okay, now we're ready for the next snapshot, and in this snapshot we're going to build our database. So here we are in Snapshot 5. This time, as you can see, we have a couple of new files that have been added to the project. The first file is our rss.mdf file. So this is our SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database that we designed a couple of videos ago, and now we've actually implemented it. So I'm going to open up the Database Explorer, and I'm going to start drilling down so we can take a look at how we implemented our design database. And we're going to open up the tables. I'm just going to double click first of all on folder, since that's the highest level object, I guess you'd say, or highest level data item within our design. So folders will have a folder ID, which is the primary key, and then also folder name. Also, our primary keys have also the identity specification property turned on. And as you can see, we have specified it as a primary key for our table. Next, we have our channel. And the channel has a title. So in this case, we may want to name it MSDN. And again, this is just a specific feed that we're grabbing down from the internet on a regular basis. The URL is the actual location of that file, the RSS file, and then we're going to keep track of the date that it was last updated. And finally, we're going to have a foreign key called folder ID, which will help us associate channels to the parent folders. Finally, we'll take a look at news items. And again, a news item is going to have a title, description, link. And we're also going to keep track of the date that we acquired this particular news item. And then we have a foreign key channel ID that will link back to our channel. So the other thing that I did is also add some sample data in. So if you right click and select show table data, you can see that I've added a number of values here for the folders, so technology, sports, and news. And I did a little bit of that for channel and news item as well. So as you're going through and developing applications, sometimes you don't want to get straight to the functionality where you're going to be able to add new items or edit items. So we don't want to work just yet on the channel dialog or the folder dialog, so I need to add some sample data in just to make sure that that main form will work as I thought it would, because that's really my next area of focus after I finish with the database construction. And sometimes we'll need some sample data in order to make that work. Finally, just here you can see a specific news item. And so I haven't put a lot of information in, but that's about enough for right now. So the next step for me, the next snapshot will have me binding the values that are stored in the database with my main form, and the way I'm going to do that is through the use of a data set. And so to a certain extent, I've already started down that path. You can see that basically once I had my database in place, I was able to click Add New Data Source, which created for me the RSS dataset.xsd. Let's open that up. So the folder, channel, news item structure resembles that of our database, and we'll use this data set as a temporary storage mechanism to grab data from the internet, place it in here, and then eventually write those values into our persistent storage, our rss.mdf file. And also the other way around, we're going to pull data from RSS.mdf, place it into our data set for use within our main form, and so on. And so we can see that we've already gone about the task of starting to hook up some of these things, like the folder, for example, the folder dropdown, by setting the data source and the display member and the value member. I'm able to begin to display some things on screen. So let's go ahead and run this, for example. Not sure how far we'll actually get through this example, but as you can see, I was able to bind to a specific folder And by selecting a folder, it gave me a selection of channels. By selecting a channel, it gave me all the news items that are currently associated with that channel or were plucked down from that channel. And I've been displaying those in the title, description, date posted, and my URL comes up in my web box. So now I've got a more fully functioning version of my example. And so in the next snapshot, I'm going to need to kind of perfect this because there's some piece of this that don't quite work exactly the way I needed to. I was able to accomplish this pretty much exclusively through the use of the little task menus that pop open by setting the binding sources, the display, the value member for each of the list box types. So you can see here, and for a news item as well. And then setting for the specific text boxes, going to the property window, and as you can see here, setting the binding property. Let's see, where is that? Here we go. For data bindings, I was able to select, in this case, the description from the news item binding source, so that when somebody selects a new item from our list box, that it will change the title, description, date posted, and so on. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the next snapshot. Because programmatically we want to also control this whole process and make sure that things are working the way that we want them to. So I'm going to reserve that discussion for a little bit later.